Hey guys, what is going on? Redmaster here, and welcome back to Cards and Castles, another edition of Meta Monthly, this time covering the March and April 2018 season. Now, there's certainly been quite a shakeup in the meta a bit, definitely since the last time we've done this. And before we start, I am happy to announce that trap decks aren't going to be part of the video. It's the first time since TEG dropped. So without getting, too much ahead of myself here, let's hop in to the first deck of the new, well, not the new season, it's been out for a while, but this edition of Meta Monthly. And the first deck we're going over for this edition of Meta Monthly is the, what people are calling Monster Mid Game. That's sort of become like a name for it. But essentially, if you want a reference to the last video, it's essentially that deck plus the addition of Green White, which kind of do similar things. But let's just jump into the first or the original, the Viking Pirate, and see why that's still popular. Well, obviously there's still the Salahar Voyager combination, Voyager plus Grendel Minotaur King Crab, however you want to make it. That's still very popular. Things like Dwarven Scope and Lightning Blade still very deadly buff spells to put on units. And the recent additions of Rat Hovel is becoming more and more popular. Since we've seen Altar decks, and Altar is still, you could throw that in here as well since Altar is a neutral, but some of the pirate ones are actually favoring rats a little more, especially in the green-white, due to the fact that they can, of course, move faster and don't have like a sluggish like the zombies. So getting them out there, and then if you're playing white, have the room for maybe a companion play if you're going that route. Definitely why Rat Hovel is going to be better than Altar in this scenario. Although Altar, of course, still used in this deck. This is sort of like an older deck that I'm kind of showing you, based I think on from the last video I did. So there's definitely been some changes since then, obviously. But again, we still have the Southport Captain ramp. That's still going strong in the deck. As I mentioned, Voyager still going strong. Recent addition of Rats and the mixing into that Druid faction give you some more possibility to play with. Let me just show you right here. I hit the back button, meant to hit the close button. But this is sort of maybe like a similar deck that you'd see. Maybe not similar. I mean, the aspect of Captain, buff, you got the hovels, sometimes even Blacksmith, mugging for ramp. I mean, mine's a little different, but essentially maybe like this area right here between Forest Revolt and Fenrir will be shifted out for more monster stuff. You'd see more Voyager, Grendel, and Minotaur in that range. But Sharpshooter as well, especially becoming a bit popular lately in these decks as well. Not sure, not completely sure as to why. Some people have been using him for the range, buffing that with the Dwarven Scope means you're getting very powerful chip damage on Castle. So probably that's why Sharpshooter's in there. He takes advantage of the scope for that long range shot. But overall, definitely one of the weaker. I mean, to be honest, it was having a difficult time picking a third deck for the video. I had my number two or number one and two decks solidify, but number three was a tough one. There are a great many decks going around right now, and as I mentioned, traps aren't really. I mean, they're still used, but not as heavily or frequently as they used to be. I mean, you still have those occasional trap players you'll run into out there, but nothing as serious as when TEG first dropped. So we definitely see change in that regard. But yeah, it was difficult picking this sort of third deck, and I think that these mid-game monsters, however, whichever colors, either the green-white or the blue-green, they're still very, very strong. I mean, I would say obviously the weakness of this deck is going to be early aggression. You don't want to have that Voyager pop out, and then summon up a Grendel Minotaur and Tyrannosaur, or not Tyrannosaur, but a Grendel Minotaur King Crab. I would say probably the best counter for Voyager right now is the Flame of Eternity trap card, in which case, if Voyager is summoned, you immediately burn it, and her initiative just doesn't happen. So now they've essentially wasted their turn 4, and you can push up even further. So it puts them behind a little bit, but I wouldn't say, I mean, Flame of Eternity is already sort of like a trap card that has seen some play, but not as much as I expected it to. But that's probably the one counter that I can immediately think of off the top of my head that can stop these mid-game monsters. Burning Voyager to cut off, her initiative, meaning that they have to pass their turn because they just probably wasted all of theirs summoning that Voyager on turn 4. So, other than that, though, the deck does have some very, very strong aspects. Of course, the stats of the Grendel Minotaur. Their late game stuff is very powerful. Their ramp potential. Of course, buffs from Armory and Blacksmith. Spells like Lightning Blade and Dwarven Scope they have access to. All very strong stuff. So, in my opinion, that's why mid-game monsters tops out at number 3 for this edition of Meta Monthly. And definitely, I mean, to be honest, they may falter in the next season, but that's yet to be seen. So anyway, with that being said, let's move on into our next deck. And for this next deck, we're going to be actually looking into the Yellow-Green Greed. That's right, they've fallen off of the number 1 spot, I think, since the last edition. I'm trying to hark back in memory here. I think they were number 1 on the Meta Monthly for the last season, if you want to call it that. I know my season references are a little choppy, but they are going to be at our number 2 spot, of course, in this edition. They haven't really lost any power since the last time we looked into this deck, but the number 1 deck, which we'll talk about soon, is their prominence, or their ascendance, or should I say, is what beats them above the green-yellow greed. Although green-yellow is still powerful despite using greed or not, this deck I actually have in front of you is a greed example. I did run a good stuff, I think previously as a 3K deck. I still have that deck. But greed's what you're really seeing in green and yellow nowadays, because their power just really hasn't diminished all that much. And since, the time passed between TEG launch and today, we're realizing now that greed really hasn't been nerfed all that too much. We've just had a bunch of introductions with new stuff that sort of overshadowed the greed. But now greed's still pretty prominent. It's taken back its spot. Obviously cards in green, the ramp, of course, estate, mugging, Southport captain, very powerful stuff. And even Robins, people go to heights to include that. And obviously Robin's not a bad card for greed, especially you're getting 5+ gold plus additional draw from the School of Knowledge. I mean, School of Knowledge is still a very hot card right now. I don't really see this card decreasing in power all too soon unless there's been like a heavy nerf to it. Its 2 gold health is more easily burnable. Things like a Flamestorm now can just poof it away, and people are carrying that in their Warlock decks, especially since for what is currently at the number 1 spot. So obviously there are counters to School of Knowledge, and obviously the weakness. If you cut off School of Knowledge early, it gives them it creates a harder time for the deck to draw into cards that they need. They're not cycling through their decks fast enough, and all of a sudden they're just sitting here with a bunch of gold, but literally nothing to spend that gold on if you cut off their resources pretty quickly. In terms of their strength, though, I did mention the ramp, of course, earlier. They also have cards like Knight of Flowers, Witch Doctor, Tyrannosaur, all just beefy units and pretty hard to handle if you're not running the right stuff. And obviously, like I mentioned, Arbiter's Return. Well, I didn't mention Arbiter's Return, but obviously I mentioned Robins, an incredible ramp, Kraxus, a draw machine, and of course the Arbiter's Return, big castle heal. Some are even running Hands of the Saint, if I, am remembering correctly some of the decks that I've seen. But Arbiter's Return, big heal, 4/5 on the board. It's still a crazy card, and one that I, again, don't see losing prominence anytime soon unless there's a heavy hit to it. But I don't really see that happening in the near future, as much as I would like to see Arbiter's Return sort of slow down a bit and let other decks, rise that aren't Crusaders, but that's how it is. So with that, there's really not much to be said on this deck. I did go more into these colors again previously on my last Meta Monthly, so be sure to check that out if you want more of an analysis on them. But overall, Greed is still a very popular, still very hot archetype deck to run. And, yeah, I just don't see them losing prominence anytime soon. But the only reason they did, as I mentioned, is because of our number 1 deck of the month, or Meta Monthly per se. So, with that being said, let's hop in and see what deck has taken the number 1 spot for this season and this edition of Meta Monthly. And our final deck that has taken the number 1 spot on this edition of Meta Monthly is the Undead. Now, about 2 or 3, maybe 4 days after I made my last Meta Monthly video, that's when we really started to see the Undead deck surge in growth. They sort of, I mean, to be fair, people were already sort of looking at Undead, before the last Meta Monthly, and, in weeks prior. Undead wasn't a completely dead archetype, But people slowly started to realize the power and the trouble that Unholy Altar began to cause, and that's really what the decks have been centered around. Getting that continual 2-2 body out on the field every turn. It really becomes difficult to control, especially when they're buffed by things like Blacksmith, Armory, Necromancer. The more buffs they get and the more zombies, whether they are just zombies or the skeletal pirates, regardless, they start to become trouble, and too many of them end up, completely dominating, completely locking the board. Especially we've seen Eternal Darkness. That card has been incredibly useful to a lot of undead players in spawn locking the board. In which case, maybe an unsuspecting player puts a building down behind their castle, sort of a usual place for people to put buildings nowadays, just so they don't really get hit or out in the open. Excuse me, for enemies to hit. But what that does is it creates a spawn lock potential for undead players. As soon as they play the Eternal Darkness in the right position and have the right amount of zombies from it, they completely lock you out of a spawn. They surround the castle on all possible spawn points, and you can't kill your own building to do so. So you have to rely on whatever units or burn spells you have to free up a summoning space just to get your guys out on the field. And that already could take a decent amount of resources to do. And say if you have no units out on the board, and maybe no burn spells, then that's eventually it. They can spawn lock you, and that's a win for them. So spawn locking is a viable strategy, and one that we've seen undead players dominating recently. But despite that, they do, of course, as I mentioned, the ramp, which has been extremely useful to all decks now. Pretty much every deck on this Meta Monthly list has some sort of ramp, and usually that is going to be Southport Captain, plus mugging if they are running mugging, maybe Master Thief sometimes, or they could switch it up and do a different Merchant Estate, that too, they can do that. But ramp, of course, very popular among all decks recently, so there's no surprise that people are running the red-green variant for that more over the heal. Because if you run the heal, sure, you can guarantee that, oh, if I get hit on my castle, I can always heal that back up with maybe Arbiter's Return or Hand to the Saint. But I think just the ramping and a quicker spawn lock is what people look for in the red-green. And, not to mention you have cards like Sea Witch in there, Ship of the Damned. I know some people like to run that. Two Skeletal Pirates out. It's essentially like a reverse Asan City Guard, so people can run that, and those get buffed by, of course, Necromancer as well. And I mean, some people even throw in the Robins. I don't have Robins in this deck, but I know some people like to run the Robins. Just that 5+ gold to not only invest but to combo kill with. It's pretty good there. And of course, mine's a little different. I know people don't really play Drain Life or Arc Fire, but people play the Defective Flame Cannon and the Blue Firebolt for your burn spell. So you have red burn access as well. So I think the deck overall is just a nice combination of ramp and burn, excuse me. And then, of course, the additional spawn locking potential over there. And of course, Mordok, T-Rex, you still got those big boys. You're losing some of the, or you're losing really Kraxus from yellow and Arbiter. But you can honestly switch over to the red-yellow and boom, there's Kraxus and Arbiter in your deck too. Maybe you don't like Mordok or don't have Mordok. It's an easy swap, red-yellow, boom, you still got a viable undead deck. So yeah, just the complete swarm that they do from Altar, and like I said, Altar is a big part in the resurgence of Undead. If it wasn't for zombies' sort of stat change, I don't know if Undead would be alive in the capacity that it is today. But for these reasons, Altar, not Altar, I mean it does, but the Undead deck as a whole, or the Undead archetype, excuse me, I'm messing up the English language here. For that reason, the Undead archetype does take our #1 spot in this edition of Meta Monthly. A lot of factors overall, and that are just extremely overpowering. And of course, the example here at the bottom, you kind of see those aspects come into play here. Mine's again a lot of my decks are a little bit different from what you see in the meta. Obviously, people don't run Arcfire, or what else do I have in here? I mentioned Arcfire, Drain Life. I know some people don't play that, even though it's a good spell. I mean, 2 damage and then +2/+2 to a friendly unit. That's something big. But that's if you don't like what you see here, obviously go to cards.tv, check out the decks being run there. There's all sorts of examples, all sorts of ways. And you can see the commonalities though between all the decks. You'll see that they have ramp. You'll see that they like to run Eternal Darkness, Necromancer as a buff, maybe Blacksmith and Armory in there too, Dwarven Scope. They just have all of these commonalities that just make them a strong archetype. So yeah, with that being said, that's going to do it for these this edition of Meta Monthly. So, let's head out into the outro, I guess, because we're all set. Hold up, hold up. I apologize. I looked in sort of the ending of that previous segment here and forgot to mention the weaknesses of Undead. Some things slipped my mind, of course. But honestly, Undead do have they are somewhat easier to deal with, in my opinion, than some of the other decks we've seen in the past. And it really all stems to defeating that Unholy Altar. If you kind of kill off the generators, if you kind of just slow the production of those 2/2 bodies, you'll be able to control the board more. And of course, their biggest sort of spawner is that Eternal Darkness. But look at that cost. It's 8 gold. You're going to have some time before that comes out. Even with Pirate ramping, there's only so much ramping that you can do. So Eternal Darkness won't be coming out for some time, so that gives you, of course, plenty of time to just rush and make sure you can take down those generators. The 2/2 bodies, I will admit, difficult to take down since, that's essentially, a warrior stats in a 0-cost unit. So it is sort of wonky in that regard. But again, if you take out the generators, Altar for example, you should be able to hold your ground. And I do recommend playing things against them like heals. If you have big castle heals in your deck like Arbiter's Return, you should be able to outlast them, if anything. The red-green don't really have access to those heals, and with this sort of archetype being more, or not archetype, this variant being more prominent than red-yellow, there's a guaranteed chance they really won't have any heals unless they could be running Flux, but even then, the card pool of Flux doesn't really provide for an easy access to heals. So, just a recap, Altar, make sure to take that down. Make sure to keep, pressure on them. Keep those aggressive plays coming. If you need to, I wouldn't, I'm kind of trying to think about how to word this. Because sometimes people know when to hold their burns, but if you can tempt out their burns more early on into something that you maybe don't need, that's also a win. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. Just hit the generators, keep that pressure going, tempt out the burns, and then you hopefully should be fine regarding the Undead decks. Now, again, this may not work for you 100% of the time, but that's sort of just my general guideline on the weaknesses of Undead. With that being said, guys, if you guys did enjoy this segment and this edition of Meta Monthly, be sure to do or show that you enjoyed it by clicking that like button. I forgot what that button was for a second. Share with your friends and comment down below your thoughts on this edition of Meta Monthly. What do you guys think of the current meta in the game? How do you think it might shift in the coming months? Again, be sure to tell me all of that in the comment section below. And if you are new to the channel, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. Show your support. Help us grow the channel, all by clicking that subscribe button at no additional cost to you. So, with that being said, guys, until next time, stay gaming.